Hey everyone! This time we read the Sega Arcade Revolution by Ken Horowitz. So this book covers something which I didn't really think about separating from the rest of Sega's history, but it kind of keeps in line with what Ken is doing. In another book, Ken covers the history of Sega America, so it kind of makes some sense that he's going to cover just the arcade industry. I wouldn't normally have thought, to separate all this. I would have thought maybe put it all together into one thing. But having these two separate books covering two parts of Sega really works pretty well, and I do enjoy the way that he did this. I shouldn't have been, but I was really kind of amazed at how many times their arcade division also reorganized, and not so much just the arcade division, but also like their game development as well. It seemed just like they had these constant stop starts with, especially with America, also with their arcade division here, and with like their development teams in Japan. It seemed very weird to me, and maybe this is normal, but it doesn't seem really that normal to me. He does mention a bunch of the games that Sega put out at this time. Periscope is probably the most notable of them at first, especially the ones that Sega made. They put out other stuff, but I honestly never got the feeling that really was impactful at all. It just kind of felt like more of the same from the industry. It really wasn't until the sort of like the earlier 80s, like a little bit before the crash, but right around that time when Sega was publishing games from other companies. They published some Nintendo games, and the one that really stood out was from Konami. They published Frogger. And they go over the fight that they had to have in order to publish Frogger, because the executives at the time didn't think that cute games would sell, even though they had seen Pac-Man. They kind of thought that was a fluke. And the executive that was in charge of this, she really had to fight to get Frogger, like, actually licensed by Sega. And eventually they did, and it turned out to be one of their bigger hits from the early 80s. From there, he goes into what he considers to be the golden age of Sega's arcade industry, and I tend to agree with him. This period was from 85 to... he cuts it off at 88, but I would argue you could include 89 in there as well, because that's when Golden Axe was released. But during this, 3 to 4 year period, you had games like Fantasy Zone, you had Afterburner, you had Shinobi, you had Altered Beast. You had just a whole bunch of games that were released that would become really iconic for Sega, and would also give them like a nice base of titles to release for their Master System and for their Sega Genesis. You would also see Thunderblade, and you would see Galaxy Force, and you'd see a bunch of other ones that are very well known for Sega, especially in the 80s and in the 90s. I can't believe I forgot this, but you'd also see Outrun, you would see Wonder Boy. It's just, when you look at the titles that were released at this time, it was really like, oh my god, yeah, this is really when Sega was on top of their game. It seemed like the 70s and then like the early 80s and into the mid 80s, they were kind of setting everything up, and then you just have this explosion in the late 80s where Sega just took over the arcade industry for a little bit, up until the fighting game craze in the early 90s started. Then they kind of fell off a little bit, but they were still hanging on with like games like Virtual Fighter and that sort of thing. And it was in the early 90s when you saw Sega kind of reorganize again, and they would do this, but it would set them up for just a lot of success in the future. They basically had 8 to 10 teams, which kind of mirrored like Nintendo's R&D teams, but whereas Nintendo left the arcade market, Sega still kind of kept one foot into it. And their arcade games would actually float them throughout a lot of the rough times during the late 90s. It wasn't enough to carry them as far as they needed them to be carried, but they would give them some much needed revenue that they desperately needed. Otherwise, it would have been a lot worse for Sega than it was. And it was from those R&D teams that you would see sort of like the next wave of Sega's arcade games. You'd see Virtual Cop, Virtual Fighter, House of the Dead, Crazy Taxi as well. These were the games that really kind of kept Sega in sort of like the forefront of the arcade industry. You'd see Die Hard Arcade, a bunch of them. These were the games that I remember playing when I would go to like movie theaters and whatnot. And unfortunately, that was kind of the problem for Sega's arcade industry. I never remember going to an arcade to play these in like the mid to late 90s. Arcades were still around, but they were kind of going away. They had sort of like attached themselves to the malls, and as malls started to decline, so did the arcades, unfortunately. And this is where Sega kind of took like a bit of a nasty hit. They had their console market, which wasn't doing super great after the 32X debacle and the Sega Saturn being rushed release here in the US, and them just making terrible decision after terrible decision, not releasing games that they really needed to release, and just a bunch of mistakes. So when you have that sort of revenue of, you have your arcades and then you have your home console, when the home console started to dip, they needed the arcades to step up, and unfortunately that just wasn't going to work for Sega. So there's one other thing that I wanted to mention about Sega's sort of business model with the arcades, and that is their own arcades and their own amusement centers that they had. And Ken does a really great job of kind of documenting these and showing, Sega kept trying to keep their own arcades going. They had a lot of stop and starts, unfortunately, which just kind of seems like Sega's thing, I guess. They even tried to get into like Chuck E. Cheese for a few years, and they had their own kind of like pizza time thing for 4 years from in the early 80s. It didn't really work out that well, so they had to shut that down. They kept trying. I mean, I will give them that. They kept trying to get sort of like their own standalones, their own branded arcades going. And around 2011 was when they finally just put a halt to it. This book has some of the same problems that I've had with other books like this. And I feel bad talking about it because I like this book and I like other books that have this problem, and it seems weird, but they just have too many games in them that don't need to be there. It just sort of feels like he's talking about games just to talk about them when they don't necessarily advance the story or they don't add anything to the book. I mean, great, now I know that Sega had their own Pong clone. I already knew this, and I don't really see how it advances Sega. I mean, if you want to keep the Pong clone in there, great. You don't need some of the other games that they have later on. And just from reading this, I don't really know what standout titles Sega had in the early 80s, because it sounds like they all just kind of blended in, unfortunately. So all that being said, I think this is a really great resource if you're doing research on Sega. There's a lot of really good information in here, and I'm glad that it's all in one place. If you're just doing like a casual read-through of this, it could still be pretty interesting as well. I still see it as more of like a research guide. So anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day, everybody.